Maplewood was the kind of town where time seemed to stretch just a little longer, as though the clocks themselves were reluctant to tick forward. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills, it had an air of quiet permanence that made it feel like nothing could ever disturb its rhythm. The streets were lined with modest brick houses, their gardens bursting with hydrangeas and daisies during the summer months. In the fall, the trees erupted into fiery shades of orange and red, casting long shadows over sidewalks that rarely saw much foot traffic. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a postcard or in a travel brochure. It was too ordinary for that, but it had a charm all its own, one that grew on you if you stayed long enough. I've lived here my whole life, and while I've never been one for small talk, I know the people of Maplewood well enough. There's Mrs. Peterson at the corner bakery, who always slips an extra chocolate croissant into your bag when she thinks no one's looking. Then there's Mr. Alvarez, the mechanic, whose laugh echoes through the garage like thunder whenever someone cracks a joke about his rusted-out old truck. Even the stray cats seem to belong here, weaving between parked cars with the confidence of long-time residents. Life in Maplewood moves slowly, predictably even, but that's how most folks prefer it. They don't want excitement, they want peace. That's why Officer Daniel Harper stands out so starkly against this backdrop. At 34 years old, he's been patrolling these streets for nearly a decade, yet he still feels like something of an outsider. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features softened only slightly by his perpetually furrowed brow, Daniel cuts an imposing figure in his navy blue uniform. His presence is both reassuring and unsettling. People nod politely when they pass him on the street, but few linger to chat. He doesn't invite conversation, either. His clipped responses and habit of scanning every face he meets make it clear that he's always working, even when he isn't technically on duty. Daniel came to Maplewood from Chicago, a city that couldn't be more different from this sleepy little town. Back then, he was fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself after leaving behind what he called the chaos. When pressed, he'll admit that the move was partly motivated by family obligations. His mother had fallen ill, and Maplewood was close enough to her home in Springfield for him to visit regularly, but there's more to it than that. Something about the way he talks about Chicago, the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes, makes me think he left because he needed to escape something bigger than just the noise and crowds. Whatever it was, he hasn't spoken of it since arriving here. In a town like Maplewood, crime is rare and usually minor: kids sneaking beers down by the creek, shoplifters swiping candy bars from the convenience store, the occasional domestic dispute that resolves itself before anyone can call it in. For someone like Daniel, trained to handle far worse, it must feel like being handed a paintbrush when you're expecting a sword. Yet he takes his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. Every shift begins with a meticulous check of his patrol car, every report is written with painstaking detail, and every interaction, no matter how trivial, is treated with the gravity of a high-stakes investigation. Some might call him dedicated, others might say he's overcompensating. Either way, it's hard not to notice how out of place he seems in a town where everyone else seems content to let things slide. Still, despite his intensity, or maybe because of it, there's a certain respect for Daniel among the townsfolk. They may not warm to him easily, but they trust him implicitly. If trouble ever does come knocking in Maplewood, and let's face it, trouble has a way of finding even the safest places, you'd want Daniel Harper standing guard. Whether he wants to admit it or not, this town needs him, just as much as he needs it. It started with a phone call, a simple, unremarkable request that wouldn't have raised any eyebrows in another town but felt oddly out of place in Maplewood. A woman named Clara Bennett, who ran the local flower shop, reported hearing strange noises coming from the alley behind her store late at night. She described them as scraping sounds, like metal dragging against concrete, followed by hurried footsteps fading into the distance. To most, it might have sounded like nothing more than a raccoon rummaging through trash bins, but Clara insisted otherwise. Her voice trembled as she spoke, betraying a fear she couldn't quite explain. When Daniel arrived at the scene, the alley was empty save for a few scattered leaves and a faint smell of damp earth. Nothing appeared disturbed, at least not visibly, but Daniel's instincts told him to dig deeper. He knelt beside a dumpster, running his gloved fingers along the edge until they brushed against something cold and metallic. Pulling it free, he found a crowbar smeared with fresh dirt. Its presence alone didn't prove anything illegal had occurred, but it set off alarm bells in Daniel's mind. Who carries a crowbar into an alley in the middle of the night? And why leave it behind? The next morning, Daniel visited Clara at her shop. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as he entered, contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. Clara sat behind the counter, clutching a mug of tea with both hands. Her eyes darted toward the window every few seconds, as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. Daniel listened intently as she recounted the incident again, noting the details she hadn't mentioned over the phone, the sound of voices whispering urgently, the fleeting glimpse of a shadow retreating into the darkness. It was vague, circumstantial, but it gnawed at him nonetheless. Over the following days, similar reports trickled in. Old Man Jenkins claimed he'd seen someone lurking near the community garden after sunset, though he couldn't provide a description beyond suspicious looking. A teenager walking her dog swore she heard footsteps behind her on Elm Street, only to turn around and find no one there. Each account was dismissed by most residents as paranoia or coincidence, but Daniel began connecting the dots. These incidents weren't random, they formed a pattern, subtle but undeniable. Someone was moving through Maplewood under cover of darkness, testing its boundaries, probing for weaknesses. What troubled Daniel most was the lack of evidence. Despite combing the areas where the disturbances were reported, he found nothing concrete, no fingerprints, no discarded items, no witnesses willing to step forward. Whoever was responsible knew how to stay invisible, blending seamlessly into the fabric of the town. That thought unsettled him deeply. In Chicago, criminals wore their intentions like badges, bold and brash. Here, the threat was quieter, more insidious, slipping beneath the surface without leaving a trace. One evening, as Daniel drove his patrol car along the outskirts of town, he spotted a figure darting between two abandoned warehouses. The movement was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send his pulse racing. He radioed dispatch, requesting backup, then cautiously approached the area on foot. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating broken glass and graffiti-covered walls. But the figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. All that remained was a single glove lying on the ground, its leather worn and stained. Daniel picked it up carefully, examining it under the dim light. It was too large to belong to a child, too weathered to be new. Another piece of the puzzle, but one that offered no answers. Back at the station, Daniel spread out a map of Maplewood on his desk, marking each location where unusual activity had been reported. The points formed a loose perimeter around the center of town, as though whoever was responsible was circling inward. He stared at the map for hours, trying to anticipate their next move. Was this reconnaissance? Preparation for something larger? Or simply the work of bored teenagers looking for thrills? Without more information, it was impossible to say. As the days turned into weeks, the incidents continued, growing bolder. One night, a resident discovered their shed had been broken into, though nothing was stolen. Another reported seeing a car parked on a deserted road, its engine idling, before it sped away without headlights. Each event added another layer of unease to the atmosphere of the town. People began locking their doors earlier, glancing nervously over their shoulders as they walked home. The sense of safety that once defined Maplewood was eroding, replaced by a creeping anxiety that Daniel could feel as acutely as anyone. For Daniel, the situation was personal. He had chosen Maplewood because it promised stability, a refuge from the unpredictability of urban life. Now, that promise was unraveling before his eyes. Every unanswered question, every elusive lead weighed heavily on him, fueling a growing frustration. He spent long nights reviewing surveillance footage, interviewing potential witnesses, and retracing his steps through darkened alleys. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford, his dreams haunted by fragmented images of shadowy figures slipping just out of reach. Yet amidst the mounting pressure, Daniel refused to give up. He reminded himself why he had become a police officer in the first place: to protect people, to restore order when chaos threatened to take hold. Maplewood might not have been his hometown, but it was his responsibility now. And if there was one thing Daniel Harper excelled at, it was shouldering responsibility, even when it felt like the weight of the world. The first real break in the case came unexpectedly, shattering the fragile calm that had settled over Maplewood. It was a chilly autumn evening, the kind where the wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Daniel had just finished his routine patrol and was heading back to the station when his radio crackled to life. Dispatch relayed a frantic call from Sarah Miller, a young mother living on Birch Lane. Her voice was trembling, barely coherent as she described hearing loud thuds and muffled voices outside her house. Before Daniel could respond, the line went dead. Adrenaline surged through him as he flipped on the siren and sped toward Birch Lane. The neighborhood was quiet, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. As he pulled up to Sarah's modest two-story home, he noticed her front porch light flickering erratically. The windows were dark, giving the house an eerie, abandoned look. Daniel stepped out of the car, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his service weapon. He scanned the surroundings, his breath visible in the cold air. Everything seemed still, too still. Approaching the front door, Daniel knocked firmly and called out, "Sarah? It's Officer Harper. Are you okay?" There was no response. He tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. Pushing the door open cautiously, he entered the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The furniture was undisturbed, but something felt off. A faint trail of muddy footprints led from the living room to the kitchen. Following them, Daniel discovered an overturned chair and a shattered coffee mug on the floor. Panic gripped him as he realized Sarah might not be alone. "Sarah," he called again, louder this time. Still no answer. Moving swiftly, he checked each room, his heart pounding in his chest. In the hallway, he found a cell phone lying on the carpet, its screen cracked. It was Sarah's, she must have dropped it during the struggle. Daniel's mind raced. Had she been taken? Hurt? Or had she managed to escape? He radioed for backup, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. As he waited for reinforcements, Daniel stepped outside to search the yard. The moonlight illuminated patches of disturbed soil near the back fence, as though someone had been digging hurriedly. Kneeling, he brushed away the loose dirt and uncovered a shallow hole. Inside was a bundle wrapped in black plastic. His stomach churned as he unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of tools, screwdrivers, pliers, and a pair of bolt cutters. None of it belonged to Sarah. This wasn't random vandalism, it was preparation for something far more sinister. Before Daniel could process what he'd found, a sudden noise startled him. A low growl emanated from the shadows near the tree line. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, catching a glimpse of glowing eyes before they disappeared into the woods. It wasn't human, it was a dog, feral and snarling, its hackles raised. But why would a stray be out here in the middle of the night? Daniel hesitated, torn between pursuing the animal and securing the scene. The decision was made for him when the dog bolted deeper into the forest, vanishing completely. Moments later, the backup team arrived, their flashlights sweeping across the property. Together, they conducted a thorough search of the house and surrounding area, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Her car was still in the driveway, and there were no signs of forced entry aside from the mud tracked inside. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Daniel's frustration boiled over as he paced the yard, replaying the events in his mind. Whoever was behind this had planned meticulously, leaving behind just enough evidence to taunt him without revealing their identity. Back at the station, Daniel reviewed the case files again, searching for connections he might have missed. The tools buried in Sarah's yard matched descriptions from previous burglaries in neighboring towns. Could this be part of a larger operation? He reached out to regional law enforcement agencies, sharing the details of the incident and requesting any relevant intelligence. Meanwhile, he issued a missing persons alert for Sarah, hoping someone in the community might have seen her. The discovery weighed heavily on Daniel. He couldn't shake the image of those muddy footprints leading into the kitchen or the hollow echo of Sarah's unanswered cries for help. For the first time since arriving in Maplewood, he felt truly powerless. The town's veneer of safety had been stripped away, exposing the vulnerability beneath. Every unanswered question gnawed at him, fueling a growing sense of urgency. He vowed to find Sarah, not just for her sake but for the sake of everyone in Maplewood who trusted him to keep them safe. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the map of the town. The marked locations of recent disturbances now included Sarah's house, forming an unmistakable pattern. Whoever was orchestrating these events wasn't just testing the town, they were mapping it, learning its rhythms, exploiting its weaknesses. And Daniel knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The discovery at Sarah Miller's house sent shockwaves through Maplewood, transforming the once placid town into a hive of whispered conversations and uneasy glances. Residents who had previously dismissed the strange occurrences as harmless pranks or overactive imaginations now found themselves questioning every creak of the floorboards and every shadow passing their windows. The sense of security that had defined life in Maplewood was crumbling, replaced by a collective anxiety that hung heavy in the air like a storm cloud refusing to break. For Daniel, the pressure mounted exponentially. Each day brought new challenges, new pieces of the puzzle that seemed to fit together only to reveal even more questions. The tools unearthed in Sarah's backyard pointed to a level of premeditation that chilled him to the bone. Whoever was behind this wasn't acting on impulse, they were planning, strategizing, and executing with chilling precision. It was a stark reminder of the dangers he had hoped to leave behind in Chicago, dangers that now loomed closer than ever. One of the first hurdles Daniel faced was navigating the labyrinth of bureaucracy within the police department. Requests for additional resources, such as forensic analysts and surveillance equipment, were met with skepticism from higher-ups who viewed Maplewood as a low-priority jurisdiction. "We're stretched thin as it is," Captain Lewis had said during one particularly tense meeting. "You're asking for resources we don't have, Harper. Prove this is more than just a string of coincidences, and maybe we can talk." Frustrated but undeterred, Daniel turned to alternative methods. He spent hours poring over old case files, cross-referencing them with reports from neighboring towns. Patterns began to emerge: similar burglaries, identical tools recovered at different scenes, all pointing to a coordinated effort spanning multiple jurisdictions. Armed with this evidence, he drafted a comprehensive report and submitted it to regional task forces, pleading for collaboration. Slowly, grudgingly, support began trickling in. A detective from a nearby county agreed to share intelligence, while a state trooper offered access to advanced tracking software. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Daniel struggled to maintain trust within the community. Rumors spread faster than facts, and some residents began to doubt his ability to handle the situation. At a town hall meeting organized to address growing concerns, Daniel stood before a crowd of anxious faces, fielding questions ranging from practical, "Are our homes safe?" to accusatory, "Why haven't you caught them yet?" He did his best to reassure them, emphasizing transparency and urging vigilance without inciting panic. But the skepticism in their eyes was palpable, a reminder that his reputation, and the town's faith in its police force, was on the line. Personal challenges compounded the professional ones. Sleep eluded Daniel, his nights plagued by restless thoughts and half-formed theories. Meals became sporadic, eaten hastily in the patrol car or skipped altogether. His colleagues noticed the toll it was taking, offering words of encouragement and occasional jokes to lighten the mood. "You look like you've been wrestling bears, Harper," joked Officer Riley one afternoon, handing him a cup of coffee. "Maybe take a breather before you burn yourself out." But Daniel couldn't afford to slow down. Every moment wasted was another opportunity for the perpetrators to strike again. He threw himself into the investigation with relentless determination, chasing leads that often led to dead ends. Surveillance footage revealed grainy images of hooded figures slipping through alleyways, their faces obscured. Anonymous tips poured in, most of them useless, though a few provided tantalizing glimpses of potential suspects. One caller claimed to have seen a van parked near Sarah's house on the night she disappeared, its license plate partially obscured by mud. Daniel tracked down the vehicle's registration, only to find it belonged to an elderly man with no connection to the case. Despite the setbacks, Daniel refused to give up. He leaned on his training, methodically analyzing each clue, no matter how insignificant it seemed. A strand of hair found near the buried tools was sent for DNA analysis, though results would take weeks. Footprint impressions from Sarah's yard were compared to databases of known offenders, yielding no matches. Yet each failure fueled his resolve rather than diminishing it. He reminded himself of the lessons he'd learned in Chicago: patience, persistence, and an unwavering belief in justice. The emotional toll was harder to manage. Images of Sarah's frightened face haunted him, mingling with memories of cases he'd worked in the city, cases where victims hadn't been found in time. Guilt gnawed at him, irrational but persistent. What if he'd responded faster? What if he'd noticed something earlier? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. On particularly difficult nights, he found solace in long drives along the outskirts of town, the rhythmic hum of the engine soothing his frayed nerves. Through it all, Daniel clung to one unshakable truth: he couldn't do this alone. He began reaching out to trusted allies, both within and outside the department. Detective Martinez, a former colleague from Chicago, offered advice based on similar cases he'd handled. Local mechanic Mr. Alvarez volunteered to keep an eye on suspicious vehicles coming through his garage. Even Mrs. Peterson, the baker, contributed by discreetly gathering gossip from her customers. Together, they formed a network of support, each playing a small but vital role in unraveling the mystery. As the days stretched into weeks, progress remained frustratingly incremental. But Daniel held on to hope, clinging to the belief that every step forward, no matter how small, brought him closer to answers. The threads of the case were tangled and frayed, but he was determined to weave them into something coherent. For Sarah. For Maplewood. For himself. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the breakthrough finally came, shattering the monotony of dead-end leads and mounting frustration. Daniel had spent the better part of the day reviewing surveillance footage from businesses near Sarah Miller's house, his eyes straining against the flickering images on the monitor. The rain outside drummed steadily against the station's windows, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Just as he was about to call it quits, a flash of movement caught his attention, a figure darting across the frame, partially obscured by the glare of a street lamp. At first glance, it seemed inconsequential, just another shadowy passerby. But something about the gait, the deliberate way the person moved, made Daniel pause. He rewound the footage, slowing it down frame by frame. The figure wore a hooded sweatshirt, the same type seen in other grainy clips from recent incidents. But this time, there was more, a distinct logo emblazoned on the back of the sweatshirt, partially visible as the person turned slightly. Squinting, Daniel zoomed in, his pulse quickening. It was a logo he recognized, a stylized wolf's head, the insignia of a construction company based in a neighboring town. His mind raced as he connected the dots. The tools found at Sarah's house, the careful planning, the familiarity with the town's layout, it all pointed to someone with expertise in building or demolition work. Armed with this new clue, Daniel reached out to the construction company, posing as a routine inquiry about employment verification. The receptionist, unaware of the gravity of his questions, confirmed that several employees had recently been laid off due to budget cuts. Among them was a name that sent a jolt through Daniel, Marcus Kane. The name rang a bell. He'd encountered Kane years ago in Chicago during a minor vandalism case. Back then, Kane had been a low-level troublemaker, but there had been something unsettling about him, a simmering anger beneath the surface that Daniel hadn't forgotten. Kane's profile painted a troubling picture. In his mid-30s, he had a history of petty crimes and a penchant for holding grudges. After losing his job, he'd reportedly returned to Maplewood, citing family ties as the reason. Daniel dug deeper, uncovering records of unpaid debts and a restraining order filed by an ex-girlfriend who claimed Kane had stalked her after their breakup. The pieces were falling into place, but Daniel needed concrete evidence before making a move. Late that night, Daniel decided to stake out Kane's last known address, a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of town. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air thick with the earthy scent of wet leaves. Parked a safe distance away, Daniel watched the trailer through binoculars, his breath fogging the lenses. Hours passed without incident, and just as fatigue began to creep in, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A man emerged from the trailer, hood pulled low over his face. It was Kane. He glanced around furtively before climbing into a beat-up pickup truck and driving off. Daniel followed at a discreet distance, his heart pounding as Kane navigated winding back roads, eventually pulling into an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The building was dark, its windows boarded up, but Daniel noticed faint light spilling from cracks in the walls. Parking his patrol car out of sight, he approached on foot, his flashlight off to avoid detection. The sound of voices drifted through the night, low and urgent. Peering through a gap in the boards, Daniel's blood ran cold. Inside, Kane stood with two other men, their faces illuminated by the glow of a lantern. Spread out on a table were blueprints of Maplewood, detailed maps marked with notes and symbols. Tools lay scattered nearby, including bolt cutters identical to those found at Sarah's house. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just a burglary ring, it was something far more sinister. The markings on the map suggested plans for sabotage, targeting critical infrastructure like water mains and power substations. Kane and his accomplices weren't merely testing the town's defenses, they were preparing to bring it to its knees. Realizing he was outnumbered, Daniel retreated silently, calling for backup as soon as he was safely out of earshot. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived, surrounding the warehouse with tactical precision. Daniel led the charge, his voice cutting through the night as he ordered the suspects to surrender. The ensuing confrontation was brief but intense. Kane resisted arrest, lunging toward Daniel with a wrench in hand, but the officers subdued him quickly. His accomplices surrendered without further resistance, their faces pale with shock. Back at the station, Daniel interrogated Kane, leveraging the evidence they'd gathered to break his defenses. At first, Kane denied everything, his tone defiant. But as Daniel laid out the timeline, connecting the tools, the maps, and the surveillance footage, Kane's bravado crumbled. He confessed to orchestrating the series of disturbances, admitting that he'd targeted Maplewood out of bitterness over losing his job. "This town's too perfect," he spat bitterly. Thought it was time someone shook things up. With Kane in custody, Daniel turned his attention to locating Sarah. Under intense questioning, Kane revealed that she had been taken to an isolated cabin in the woods, intended as leverage to ensure his accomplices' cooperation. A search team dispatched to the location found her alive but shaken, bound and gagged but otherwise unharmed. As paramedics tended to her injuries, Sarah locked eyes with Daniel, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely, her voice trembling with gratitude. The resolution of the case brought a wave of relief to Maplewood, but Daniel knew the scars would linger. Trust had been fractured, and rebuilding it would take time. Yet as he stood outside the station, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of gold and pink, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Against all odds, he had unraveled the mystery, protected the town, and proven that even in the darkest moments, justice could prevail. The aftermath of Kane's arrest rippled through Maplewood like the final tremors of a storm, leaving behind a landscape altered but not irreparably damaged. For Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. On one hand, the town was safe again, its streets reclaimed from the shadow of fear that had loomed over them for weeks. On the other, the ordeal had exposed vulnerabilities he hadn't fully grasped before, both in the town's defenses and in his own psyche. As he walked through the quiet neighborhoods the morning after Kane's capture, the weight of what had transpired settled heavily on his shoulders. The sense of accomplishment he felt was tempered by the knowledge that the battle had changed him, perhaps irrevocably. Daniel's relationship with the community underwent a subtle transformation in the days that followed. The initial skepticism that had greeted his efforts gave way to a newfound respect, tinged with gratitude. Residents who had once kept their distance now greeted him warmly, their smiles carrying an unspoken acknowledgement of his dedication. At the grocery store, Mrs. Peterson slipped not just one but 2 extra pastries into his bag, her eyes twinkling mischievously. "For saving us," she said simply, patting his arm before bustling back to her counter. Even old man Jenkins, who had once grumbled about Daniel's overzealous patrols, stopped him on the sidewalk to offer a gruff but heartfelt, "Good job, son." Yet beneath the surface, Daniel sensed a lingering fragility. The trust he had worked so hard to rebuild was still delicate, like glass repaired after a crack. Conversations with neighbors revealed a mix of relief and unease. "It's good to feel safe again," one woman confided, clutching her toddler's hand tightly. "But I don't think I'll ever forget how scared I was." Others echoed similar sentiments, their words underscoring a truth Daniel already knew: the illusion of invulnerability that had once defined Maplewood was gone for good. In its place was a cautious optimism, a tentative embrace of normalcy tempered by the awareness that danger could strike anywhere, anytime. For Daniel, the case had also reshaped his understanding of his role in the town. When he first arrived in Maplewood, he had viewed it as a refuge, a place where he could step away from the chaos of Chicago and find a simpler, quieter life. But the events of the past weeks had shattered that illusion. Danger didn't discriminate based on geography, it followed patterns of opportunity and vulnerability, preying on complacency wherever it found it. His job wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about anticipating threats, staying vigilant, and preparing the community to face them. It was a heavier burden than he had anticipated, but one he accepted willingly. Maplewood wasn't just his workplace anymore, it was his responsibility, his home. Professionally, the experience had honed his skills in ways he hadn't expected. The bureaucratic hurdles he'd faced early on taught him the value of persistence and diplomacy, forcing him to navigate complex systems with patience and strategy. The collaborative efforts with regional law enforcement and local allies underscored the importance of building networks of trust, reminding him that even the most solitary battles require teamwork. Most importantly, the case reinforced his belief in the power of observation and intuition. The smallest details, a muddy footprint, a flicker of movement on grainy footage, had ultimately led him to the truth. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career. On a personal level, the ordeal had left its mark in ways Daniel couldn't yet fully articulate. The sleepless nights, the gnawing guilt, the constant pressure had taken a toll, etching lines of weariness into his face that hadn't been there before. Yet they had also forged a resilience he hadn't known he possessed. He had faced his doubts, his fears, and his limitations head-on, emerging stronger for it. The memory of Sarah's tearful gratitude lingered in his mind, a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Protecting people wasn't just a duty, it was a calling, one that demanded sacrifice but offered profound rewards in return. As he stood on the porch of the station one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. The town stretched out before him, bathed in the golden light of dusk. It was still the same Maplewood he had come to know, a place of quiet charm and enduring spirit, but it felt different now, sharper somehow, as though the storm had polished its edges. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the choices that had shaped him, and the challenges that lay ahead. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain: he was ready.